The following Appalachian Mountains horror stories are real, disturbing, and should be used as warnings. The names and locations have been altered to protect the individuals involved. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine creeping into a rotting, abandoned rancher for some urban exploring. But the second you step inside, a heavy deadbolt clicks shut behind you while a shadowed figure of a man watches you from the corner. This happened a few years ago to a 22-year-old guy named Brooks. At the time, he was living with his parents in a blue-collar neighborhood in the North Georgia mountains. Brooks was finishing up his college degree online, and to keep from going crazy being cooped up all day, he took the exact same walk every single night. His route was a simple loop made of 4 right turns down regular paved neighborhood roads that didn't have any sidewalks. The second right turn of his loop was a long stretch with exactly 25 houses. Most of the properties were your standard backwoods homes. The grass was mostly mowed, even if a few yards had some random trash or an old rusted truck out front. But right in the middle of the block, right around house number 9, there was a brick rancher that looked like the owners had been evicted years ago. The grass was waist-high, the roof was dipping, and it was always pitch black. Brooks loved exploring abandoned places. So, on this one incredibly humid 85-degree night, he was walking along the edge of the asphalt right in front of house number 9, trying to build up the nerve to look inside. But out of nowhere, a guy riding a squeaky, chrome 1990s Schwinn mountain bike zipped right past him. The strangest part was, despite the sweating heat, the rider was zipped up tight in a thick, fur-lined winter parka. Brooks watched in total confusion as the biker steered off the road and rode straight into the overgrown backyard of the abandoned house. Because he couldn't just let that go, Brooks carefully stepped off the asphalt and snuck through the tall weeds, pressing his back against the brick wall of the house to spy on the stranger. He expected to hear the bike drop into the dirt or a door get kicked open, but instead, as he pressed against the brick, the entire foundation of the house began to violently shake with a heavy, mechanical hum that was so powerful it literally made his wedding ring rattle against his finger. Brooks crept to the edge of the back porch and peeked at the kitchen window to see what the machine was, but his breath hitched in his throat. Why was the glass radiating a blinding neon blue light that pulsed in perfect time with his own racing heartbeat? Brooks stood on his tiptoes to peek through that glowing blue kitchen window. The glass was caked in decades of grime and dirt, making it impossible to see exactly what was creating that massive, vibrating hum inside house number 9. To get a better look, he slid along the brick wall toward the back patio door. The overgrown, thorny blackberry bushes snagged his jeans and scraped his forearms raw as he squeezed past. He figured the heavy wooden door would be deadbolted, or at least swollen shut from the thick Georgia humidity. Instead, it was cracked open just an inch, left ajar by the guy in the winter parka. Brooks grabbed the rusted brass handle and pulled it open, bracing himself for the usual heavy stink of black mold, rotting wood, and wild animals. A blast of 100-degree, bone-dry air violently slammed into his face, carrying the sharp, metallic smell of hot copper and electric ozone. He stepped slowly into the dark kitchen, his sneakers crunching over old, dried oak leaves that had blown inside over the years. The mechanical roaring was deafening now, vibrating straight through the soles of his shoes. He clicked on his phone's flashlight and aimed it at the cracked linoleum to watch his step. As the beam swept across the floor, his stomach dropped into his shoes. Why were 6 massive, black, industrial-grade power cables snaking across the kitchen and disappearing straight down into the pitch-black basement? Brooks couldn't figure out why a totally empty house needed so much electricity. He followed those thick black cords across the dry oak leaves on the kitchen floor until they disappeared down the open basement staircase. The wooden stairs leading into the dark were completely rotted out, and the roaring mechanical hum coming from below was so loud it actually made his teeth hurt. He crept down into the pitch black, testing his weight on every single creaking step, gripping the splintered handrail while sweat poured off his chin in the baking heat. When his sneakers finally hit the concrete basement floor, he swept his flashlight across the massive room. And then, Brooks saw something that he had never seen before. The entire underground space was packed wall to wall with metal racks of glowing computer servers and massive spinning fans. It was a giant, illegal crypto mining operation, which perfectly explained the 100-degree air, the crazy power cables, and the deafening vibration shaking the foundation. Brooks let out a long, shaky breath, completely relieved that the terrifying noise was just a bunch of hot computers. He turned around to head back up the stairs and get out of there. But the second he put his foot on the bottom step, the heavy metal deadbolt on the door at the top of the stairs violently clacked shut, locking him inside the dark basement. Brooks froze, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He slowly aimed his flashlight away from the stairs and into the deepest, darkest corner of the room. As the beam of light cut through the shadows, his breath hitched in his throat. Why was the biker in the winter parka standing perfectly still in the corner, quietly watching him while gripping a rusted pair of heavy iron hedge clippers? Brooks spun around, his lungs absolutely burning from the oxygen-depleted, scorched air of the basement. The heat radiating off the massive crypto mining rigs was suffocating. He scrambled backward until his shoulders slammed into a rack of scorching hot metal servers. The metal seared through his shirt, forcing him to dart his eyes around the room, frantically scanning the heavy plywood boarded over the tiny basement windows for any possible gap to squeeze through. There was no way out through the walls. The guy who had been riding the Schwinn bike was standing at the bottom of the stairs, perfectly positioned in the only doorway. The thick hood of his heavy winter parka was pulled down low, completely hiding his face in the shadows. The biker didn't lift a weapon, didn't raise his hands, and didn't say a single word. He just casually stood there, blocking the exit. Brooks's heart hammered violently against his ribs. He dropped his stance, his sneakers gripping the concrete floor as he desperately calculated the exact angle he needed to sprint past the silent biker and smash his way back into the kitchen. He tensed his leg muscles, ready to make a blind, desperate run for his life. But just as he leaned forward to sprint, why did a second, much older man suddenly step out from the dark shadows behind the server racks, calmly wiping black grease from his hands with a clean rag? The second man stepped fully into the harsh, blinking green lights of the server racks. He didn't look like a ragged backwoods squatter at all. He was wearing a crisp, perfectly ironed canvas work shirt, expensive wire-rimmed glasses, and his silver hair was combed neatly back, but his eyes were flat, cold, and completely unbothered by the fact that Brooks was standing there sweating and hyperventilating. Brooks froze, the heavy iron pipe slipping in his clammy palms. He suddenly realized these guys weren't just local tweakers stealing copper wire. They were highly organized, dangerous professionals protecting a multi-million-dollar digital mining claim, and Brooks had just trapped himself in their basement. He braced himself for a fight, expecting the clean-cut older man to pull a gun or order the biker to attack. But instead, the older man just casually leaned his thin frame against the rotting wooden door frame and smiled a tiny, chillingly polite smile. Without raising his voice over the roaring fans, he calmly recited Brooks's full first and last name, his parents' exact address just down the street, and the specific make, model, and license plate of Brooks's beat-up car. The old man then offered a terrifyingly calm deal. He explained that the Bitcoin mining wasn't hurting a single soul in the neighborhood, so Brooks was going to turn around, walk right out that door, and never involve the cops. As long as he kept his mouth shut, these men would never have to pay a midnight visit to his family's front porch. Brooks nodded frantically, dropped the rusted pipe, and sprinted out the back door. He crashed blindly through the thorny weeds, his lungs absolutely burning from the thick, humid mountain air as he scrambled toward the safety of the main road. But as he finally reached the street and looked down toward his own house, his stomach completely bottomed out. Why was that exact same rusted chrome Schwinn bicycle already parked right at the end of his own driveway? Brooks stood completely paralyzed at the end of his gravel driveway, staring at the rusted chrome of that 1990s Schwinn gleaming under his family's flickering street lamp. The guy in the winter parka was nowhere in sight, which meant he had silently pedaled ahead, dropped the bike as a warning, and slipped into the pitch-black woods. Brooks didn't scream or run to the neighbors. He just forced his shaking legs to walk inside his house and locked the heavy brass deadbolt, knowing that if he called 911, those men would reach his family long before the county cops ever did. For the next year, Brooks kept his mouth completely shut, sitting at his kitchen table to finish his online degree while his parents remained totally clueless about how close they came to a deadly home invasion. He still needed his evening walks to keep from going stir-crazy, so he kept taking them every single night. But he completely changed his route, sticking strictly to the well-lit main highway and making absolutely sure he never ever took that second right turn back down that quiet street of brick ranchers. When people talk about the strange, dark, and mysterious things hiding in the Appalachian Mountains, they usually focus on the deep woods, wild animals, or hikers getting lost off the trail. But honestly, the scariest part about that region is actually the extreme geographic isolation that creates deep, cut-off pockets where the rest of the world just doesn't look. Because of that isolation, you can have a totally normal, blue-collar street, and right in the middle of it, highly organized, dangerous people are hiding massive, illegal operations right in plain sight. So, if you ever find yourself walking down a quiet mountain road and you suddenly feel a deep mechanical hum vibrating through your shoes, don't go looking through the windows. Just turn around and walk away. "13-year-old Canyon stood frozen in the dark as his sweet neighbor violently drove a shovel into the midnight mud. He had no idea that the strange metallic smell in the air was a warning to run before he discovered what she was really gardening. 21 years ago, tucked deep inside a steep, isolated valley in the Pennsylvania Appalachian Mountains, lived a 13-year-old kid named Canyon. This holler was the kind of place where the sun disappeared behind the tree-choked ridges by 4 o'clock, casting long, dark shadows over everything. A single crumbling asphalt road snaked up the mountain and dead-ended at a gravel cul-de-sac. Canyon was desperate for exactly $80 to buy a beat-up Yamaha dirt bike from a friend. Without it, he was doomed to spend his entire summer walking miles up and down blindingly hot, humid mountain blacktop. He decided to hustle, marching to the absolute dead end of the cul-de-sac to Mrs. Gable's house. She was the classic neighborhood grandmother, always wearing a woven sun hat, always smiling, and spending 10 hours a day tending to her massive, prize-winning rhododendron bushes. Canyon walked up her perfectly swept driveway to ask for work, and she handed him a crisp $10 bill up front just to clear some dandelions near her front porch. It was easy money, and the front yard smelled pleasantly of fresh mulch. He knocked it out in 20 minutes. Just as he finished, Mrs. Gable handed him a plastic bucket of the pulled weeds and asked him to dump it out back, right along the edge of the deep woods. Canyon grabbed the bucket and walked around the side of the house. The moment he crossed into the backyard, the atmosphere violently shifted. The dense Pennsylvania timber bordering her property looked unnaturally dead. There were no cicadas buzzing in the thick summer air, no crows cawing in the oaks, just a heavy, suffocating silence that made his ears ring. Even worse, the air back there didn't smell like pine needles or mountain clay. It smelled thick, like wet, turned earth mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of an old penny. It didn't scream outright danger, but something sat deeply wrong with him. He didn't want to linger for even a second, so he quickly dumped the bucket into the brush, left the pail on the grass, and jogged straight back down the road to his own house. He went right to the side of his garage and cranked on the garden hose. The freezing water blasted the grime away, but as he lifted his hands to dry them on his shirt, his stomach completely dropped. If Mrs. Gable was just growing rhododendrons, why did the dark soil caked under his fingernails smell exactly like rotting meat? Later that exact same night, a brutal Appalachian summer thunderstorm rolled over the mountain. If you've never been in a deep Pennsylvania holler during a storm, you need to understand that the thunder doesn't just rumble. It echoes off the steep ridges and physically shakes the foundation of your house. Around midnight, a massive strike of lightning hit nearby, and the power grid for the entire cul-de-sac instantly blew out. Canyon was wide awake in the pitch black. He crawled out of bed, walked over to his bedroom window, and pressed his face against the cold glass to look at the flooding street. Suddenly, a jagged fork of lightning lit up the neighborhood like a stadium spotlight. Right there, in the middle of the torrential downpour, was Mrs. Gable. She didn't have her woven sun hat on, and she wasn't running for cover. She trudged straight toward the pitch-black tree line behind her house. She dragged a heavy, soaked burlap sack through the mud. Another flash of lightning strobed across the sky. The sack wasn't just heavy, it was violently writhing. Something inside that bag was fighting frantically to get out. Canyon's mouth went totally dry. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it physically ached. He backed away from the glass, crawled under his blankets, and squeezed his eyes shut until the sun finally came up. The next morning, the storm cleared. Canyon walked out to his family's rotting wooden shed to feed his only real friend in this isolated neighborhood, a stray, half-blind orange barn cat named Rusty. He poured the dry kibble into the metal bowl and called out. Rusty always came running. This morning, only a heavy, dead silence answered him. Canyon stared at the untouched food bowl as a freezing cold knot formed in his stomach. If Rusty was just hiding from the storm, then what exactly was fighting for its life inside Mrs. Gable's burlap sack at midnight? By Thursday afternoon, the brutal Appalachian humidity returned, hanging over the valley like a hot, wet wool blanket. Canyon was officially out of time. His buddy with the Yamaha dirt bike issued an ultimatum. Bring the remaining $70 by Friday morning, or the bike was getting sold to a kid 2 hollers over. Canyon's stomach did backflips at the thought of Mrs. Gable, but pure desperation hijacked his brain. He marched right back up that crumbling asphalt road, his worn-out sneakers kicking up clouds of dry limestone dust. Mrs. Gable sat on her front porch, gently rocking in a wooden chair and sipping a glass of iced tea. She smiled her trademark, sweet smile and offered him exactly $70 for one specific heavy-duty job. She needed him to dig a deep hole out by the back tree line so she could plant a massive new rhododendron bush. Every instinct told him to run, but that dirt bike clouded his judgment. He grabbed a rusted iron spade from her garage and walked back into that dead, suffocating zone behind her house. The thick stench of wet copper and rotting meat was 3 times stronger than before. He drove the heavy spade into the dark, unnaturally soft soil. A swarm of fat green bottle flies aggressively swirled around his sweaty neck. He dug exactly 3 feet down, his shoulders burning from the effort. Suddenly, the heavy metal blade didn't hit packed dirt or a tough tree root. It sank deeply into something yielding, producing a wet, sickening tear. Canyon froze, a freezing metallic taste flooding his mouth. If Mrs. Gable was just preparing the ground for a flower bush, why did a clump of soaked orange fur just stick to the edge of his shovel? Canyon stared at the clump of soaked orange fur stuck to the edge of his rusted spade. His lungs completely stopped working. He dropped to his knees in the wet black dirt and used his trembling hands to frantically brush the loose soil away from the bottom of the 3-foot hole. A torn, mud-caked burlap sack lay half buried in the earth. The overwhelming stench of rotting meat and wet copper instantly burned his throat. He hooked 2 fingers into the ripped fabric and pulled it back. What Canyon saw next almost made him violently throw up right there in the dirt. There, tangled in the muddy burlap, was the mangled, decaying body of his half-blind barn cat, Rusty. Canyon gagged, his stomach aggressively heaving. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, desperate to get away from the swarming green bottle flies. But as his muddy palms slapped against the sides of the trench, the soft earth crumbled away, revealing something infinitely worse. The walls of the hole weren't made of rocks or tough tree roots. Dozens of small, rotting burlap sacks were packed tightly together, stacked on top of each other like horrifying bricks beneath the dirt. He wasn't digging a hole for a new rhododendron bush. He was expanding a massive, hidden graveyard. Pure adrenaline exploded in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming at him to sprint back to the safety of the crumbling asphalt road. But as he frantically spun around, why was Mrs. Gable standing silently right at the edge of the grave, gripping a heavy iron garden hoe and completely blocking his only way out of the woods? Mrs. Gable didn't raise the heavy iron garden hoe to attack him. She didn't even look angry. She just stood there at the edge of the rotting graveyard, wearing her woven sun hat, holding out 3 crisp $20 bills and a 10. She smiled her sweet grandmotherly smile and gestured for him to take his final payment for digging the hole. Canyon's brain completely short-circuited. Pure, panicked survival instinct took over. He reached out with a trembling, dirt-caked hand, snatched the $70 right out of her fingers, and ran. He bulldozed straight through the dense, briar-choked Appalachian brush. Razor-sharp thorns shredded his cotton t-shirt, but a massive spike of adrenaline completely numbed the pain until his worn-out sneakers finally hit his own front porch. He burst through the front door, grabbed the kitchen landline, and immediately dialed 911. Within 20 minutes, 2 county sheriff cruisers roared up the crumbling asphalt road, their red and blue lights flashing against the dark timber. Canyon led the deputies straight to the tree line. As the officers dug into the unnaturally soft mounds, their faces went totally pale. They quickly uncovered dozens of mangled cat bodies packed in the dirt. It got worse. When the deputies snapped the rusted padlock off the sweltering metal storage shed, they physically recoiled. The beams of their flashlights revealed hundreds of severed, fuzzy cattails tied to the wooden rafters with fishing line, gently swaying in the dead, hot air. Mrs. Gable didn't fight the police. As they gently buckled her into the back of the cruiser, she cheerfully ranted to the horrified deputies about how disrespectful outdoor cats were to her prize-winning rhododendrons. Canyon stood in his yard, his heart hammering against his ribs. The squad car shifted into gear to take her away. He expected her to glare at him through the window with pure hatred. But as the cruiser slowly rolled down the mountain, why was Mrs. Gable pressing her face against the glass, cheerfully waving at him like he had just done her a polite neighborly favor? 21 years have passed since that sweltering afternoon in the Pennsylvania holler. Canyon is 34 years old now. He is happily married, living states away from those steep, shadow-choked Appalachian ridges. After watching Mrs. Gable roll away in the back of that sheriff's cruiser, Canyon took his $70, bought that beat-up Yamaha dirt bike, and eventually rode it straight out of that dead-end neighborhood. He has absolutely never gone back. He learned a deeply unsettling lesson that summer. When people tell terrifying campfire stories about the Appalachian Mountains, you usually expect the villain to be some screaming cryptid hiding in the deep timber, or a paranormal force stalking lost hikers. Mrs. Gable was eventually locked away in a secure state medical facility. Her property was completely abandoned, and the thick, briar-choked woods slowly swallowed her prize-winning rhododendrons and that sweltering corrugated metal shed. Canyon survived that holler and built a safe, peaceful life for himself, far away from the dark timber. But to this day, he refuses to ever step foot near the Appalachian Mountains again. He knows perfectly well that in those deep, isolated hollers, the most dangerous monsters don't hide in the dark woods. Sometimes they stand right out in the daylight, smiling at you from their front porch. Henry stared through the peephole at the golden retriever on his porch, frozen by the fact that the dog hadn't aged a single day since he'd abandoned it in the mountains 7 years ago. He desperately wanted to believe his best friend was finally home, but the way the animal sat perfectly still in the shadows, staring directly at the door handle, made his blood run cold. To understand why this completely shattered Henry's reality, we have to go back 7 years to a random, totally normal Thursday. Henry was just 16 years old, living deep in a remote pocket of the Appalachian Mountains. If you've never been out that way, it is incredibly isolated. The valleys, or hollers as locals call them, are choked with dense, ancient timber, and the cell service is basically non-existent. Every morning on his boring bus ride to high school, Henry would stare up at a distant, jagged ridgeline where an ancient, rotting hunting cabin sat barely visible through the trees. He became completely obsessed with getting up there. So, instead of sitting through math class, he stuffed a heavy iron crowbar into his canvas backpack, whistled for his golden retriever, Zeus, and started the brutal hike up the mountain. But the Appalachian woods don't like visitors. The higher they climbed, the more the environment actively fought back. The temperature dropped like a stone, and thick webs of razor-sharp blackberry briars violently ripped at his jeans and arms. He forced his way through the heavy brush, finally reaching the clearing and prying open the warped cabin door. He expected dust and empty ruins. Instead, the sharp metallic smell of wood smoke punched him right in the face. Heavy, fresh boot prints were stomped into the dirt floor, leading right to a campfire that was still radiating heat in the stone hearth. The place wasn't abandoned at all. A freshly opened, half-eaten can of dog food sat dead center on a rotting wooden table. But why in the world was there fresh dog food sitting inside a cabin where no human had legally lived for decades? A cold knot of dread tightened in Henry's gut. This wasn't just some forgotten ruin. He had stumbled right into an active squatters' or poachers' camp hidden deep in the lawless Appalachian backcountry. Knowing the kind of people who hid out in these mountains, he panicked, grabbed Zeus's nylon collar, and yanked hard toward the door. He had to get them out of there before whoever owned those heavy boots came back. But Zeus flat out refused to move. The golden retriever planted his paws, aggressively sniffing the edges of a heavy trap door built right into the floorboards. The thick ridge of fur along the dog's spine stood straight up like wire bristles. Henry's hands shook violently, but the adrenaline forced him to act. He jammed his iron crowbar under the wood and heaved backward, prying the trapdoor open. A hot, foul-smelling wave of rotting meat instantly burned his throat, rising from a dark crawl space utterly littered with shattered animal bones. Henry covered his nose and mouth, backing away from the edge. But as the dust settled, what in the world was making that low, guttural clicking sound coming from the darkest corner of the crawl space? That deep, guttural clicking sound echoing out of the dark beneath the floorboards was all it took to signal a very real physical threat. Every survival instinct in Henry's body screamed at him to run. He dropped the heavy wooden trapdoor and sprinted toward the cabin exit in sheer blinding panic. He fully expected to hear his dog's paws scrambling right behind him. But Zeus didn't follow. The golden retriever's protective instincts completely took over. Instead of running out the door with Henry, the dog let out a vicious, snarling bark and dived straight down into the pitch-black crawl space. Henry froze on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. From beneath the floor, he heard a violent, horrific scuffle erupt. Wood splintered, dirt kicked up through the gaps, and the sound made Henry sick to his stomach. The sheer terror overpowered him. He panicked and ran all the way down the steep mountain alone, leaving his dog behind. He didn't stop running until his lungs burned and he hit the main dirt road at the bottom of the valley. But when Henry returned with the local police the very next morning, why was the cabin completely empty and smelling strongly of industrial bleach? All right, let's jump forward in time. The aftermath of that day completely broke Henry. Over the next 7 years, local wildlife officials officially presumed Zeus was dead. Henry was now 23 years old, and he had moved far away from those dark mountain hollers, settling into a basic rental house in a populated suburban town. To manage his lingering, heavy trauma, he locked himself into a strict, isolated routine. He installed bright motion sensor lights all around the property. He created a quiet, tightly controlled safe zone in this new suburban home where nothing unpredictable could ever happen. But the crippling guilt of leaving his best friend behind in that cabin still haunted him. He absolutely refused to own another pet. If a stray animal even walked down his sidewalk, his chest would violently tighten up and he would force himself to look away. Then came 2 a.m. on a random, totally normal Thursday. Henry jolted awake in the dark, his heart slamming against his ribs. A thick 6-foot privacy fence, securely locked from the inside, completely surrounded his backyard. But if his yard was completely sealed off, what in the world was making that heavy, rhythmic scratching against his glass back door? Henry's breath hitched in his throat as he flipped the back porch light switch. Standing right there on the concrete patio, caked in thick, foul-smelling mountain mud, was a golden retriever. It looked exactly like Zeus, completely unaged from that terrible day 7 years ago. Desperate for a miracle, Henry yanked the glass door open for a bittersweet reunion and let the animal inside. Over the next month, they settled into a bizarre routine. The dog was rarely inside during the day. When Henry left for his normal work shift, the animal would vanish, but it was always sitting perfectly still on the porch when Henry returned. However, the dog violently rejected any physical touch. It refused the water bowl, choosing instead to drag its rough tongue across the cold windows to lick off the condensation. When it was inside the house, it claimed a specific spot next to the living room sofa and weirdly, aggressively guarded the space underneath the cushions, flashing its teeth if Henry even walked past it. This tense arrangement totally shattered when 2 neighborhood kids reached through the gaps in Henry's backyard fence, and the dog launched a vicious, blood-drawing attack against the wood. Facing severe legal trouble with the police and animal control, Henry realized he was harboring a highly dangerous feral predator. To save himself from jail, he shoved the snarling dog out the front door and slammed the deadbolt shut. His chest heaved with panic as he sank to the living room floor. But if the dog was only defending the yard from local kids, why were there heavily chewed, blood-stained strips of a grown man's flannel shirt shoved deep under his sofa? Horrified by the chewed, bloody flannel shirt he pulled from under his sofa, Henry immediately deadbolted every single door and window in his house. He barricaded himself inside his suburban safe zone and obsessively called animal control, begging them to come capture the dangerous, feral predator roaming his property so this nightmare could finally end. But the county officers never caught a thing. The dog seemed to possess a deeply unnatural intelligence. The absolute second the headlights from an animal control truck turned onto Henry's street, the golden retriever would simply melt away into the deep shadows of the tree line, only to return hours later. Henry was left completely isolated, trapped in a state of exhausting, paranoid hypervigilance. He knew for a fact that the thing outside was not his best friend. The deep, isolated Appalachian woods don't just kindly give things back after 7 years. Sometimes, whatever is out there in the dark just wears a familiar skin so it can get closer to the warmth. And now, at 2 a.m. on any given Thursday, Henry can look through his glass peephole and see that completely unaged dog sitting just past the glow of the streetlights. It doesn't bark and it doesn't pant. It just sits perfectly still in the cold shadows, staring directly at his front door handle.